Hello, my name is Philip Pettit, and I'm delighted to be able to speak at the Wuhan Summer School of Philosophy. I'm just sorry that I can't be with you all in person, indeed, that we can't any of us be with one another in person. I'm going to give a lecture under the title The Sovereignty of the People, and I'm going to do it in three parts, each in a half-hour recording. So let's get straight in. There's a problem about the sovereignty of the people that is raised really in the first place, by constitutional democracies. Because after all, a constitutional democracy claims two things. First of all, to be democratic, and secondly, to be constitutional. Now, in claiming to be democratic, it's basically claiming that the people are in charge, in a common phrase, that the people are sovereign within a democracy. But in claiming to be constitutional democrats claim that the state ought to be organized in such a way that there are many different authorities that check and balance one another. Some of those are elected, of course, like the legislatures and perhaps the administrators, the executive. But others are not. They're appointed, like judges, for example, or like inspectors general, or like auditors, or like the Bureau of Statistics. These are bodies that play an important part in the state and that check and balance those who are elected. And of course, those who are elected check and balance one another too. So the state is not just democratic, the constitutional democratic state, it's also decentralized in that sense. And the problem is, how can the people be the sovereign in a constitutional democracy, be in charge, if actually there are all these different agencies within the state, each checking and balancing one another, each claiming its own level, as it were, of power, its own area of power. Okay, I'm going to address this issue in three parts, as I said. Today, this recording is the first part. The three parts are going to be discussing, first of all, what is sovereignty? That's today. And secondly, as it were, the inconsistency thesis that some people do defend, that actually constitutionalism and democracy are in tension with one another, are inconsistent with one another. And then in the third part, I'm going to argue against the inconsistency thesis and argue that, yes, the people can be the sovereign in a constitutional democracy, in a decentralized, if you like, democracy. Okay, so let's get started on the first issue of what is sovereignty. Well, the interesting thing is that the notion of sovereignty, as it's described in English and the various European languages, that it really only appears in a serious sense in the 1500s. It was introduced in a central role in political thought by a French theorist called Jean Bodin, B-O-D-I-N, and his view, his belief in sovereignty and the need for a sovereign, which I'll tell you about in a moment, it was adopted basically by Thomas Hobbes, the English political philosopher in the 1600s, the 17th century. And in effect, a lot of it was adopted by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher of the 1700s, the 18th century. So let's see what Bodin's argument was for the need for sovereignty. He, first of all, came of a background where it was accepted in Europe, and had been for a number of basically centuries, that the Roman law, which had been rediscovered in Europe about 1100, that the Roman law was actually a law that applied in almost all states, and since that law was not laid down by any particular ruler in any particular state, It served almost like a sacred script of legal constraint on what any ruler could do. And it was accepted widely as a constraint also on how states could treat one another. Now, of course, insofar as Roman law was given that role, it was taken as almost dictated from above, from an older tradition, and it wasn't regarded as something made by the local government. Baudin changed all of that, and he had a very simple argument in a book called The Six Books of the Republic, which was published in 1576, and the argument goes like this. The first premise is that law is command. Basically, this was Baudin being a no-nonsense person. He had been part of a group criticizing Roman law in any case as being inconsistent. The Roman law that people knew was the law as handed down in the books of Roman law brought together by Justinian, the Eastern emperor, in the 6th century, and as I say, rediscovered in Europe in the early Middle Ages, about 1100. He had argued, Baudin and others, that actually it was a mess in any case, and in a no-nonsense rejection of that approach, he said, look, what is law? Basically what law is, it's command. The laws are the commands that people are subject to in any state. First premise. But then he argues from that, if the law is command, then there must be a commander. There must be someone to give those commands, someone or somebody that stands behind the commands as the commander. And not only that, this commander must be generally accepted as the one who is the source of law, as the one who can lay down the law as a matter of socio-personal command over the subjects of the state. Okay, so if law is command, and there has to be a commander, and that commander has to be generally accepted, Baudin thought that a couple of different things followed from that. First of all, there couldn't be anyone to whom the commander was subject, at least in the making of law and the organization of the state. Because if there was someone to which he was subject, or she was subject, or it was subject, then that other party would be the true sovereign, the true commander. The commander that you thought was there would really be accepting instructions from someone else, and that someone else would be the true commander. That's one implication he drew from his view of law as command. The second one was this. He observed, you can't give yourself commands. I mean, I might say, sit up, pay attention to myself, but it's not really a command. And it's not a command like somebody else might give me, because when you give a command, presumably the assumption is that there's a sanction in place if you don't obey the command, but you can't sanction yourself in that way. And so he argued that just as there can be no other body or individual who is above the commander who makes the law, so that commander isn't himself or herself or itself bound by the law that it makes. The commander is above the law. And now he introduced the word sovereign to describe the commander that he assumed has got to be present in any legal regime. The sovereign, he said, therefore, was absolute in power, above the law, but also above everybody else, so to speak, within the community. So the sovereign for Baudin could be either an individual or a group. And he thought there were two possibilities of a group being the sovereign. One would be what he called aristocracy and the other democracy. If there were a single individual who was the sovereign, then that, of course, was monarchy. That was a single king who was the source of all law, who laid down what law was and how it was to be enforced and so on. If the group that was the sovereign was a group, an assembly of the few, as it were, the elite, then it was an aristocracy. And he said it would be a democracy. The sovereign would be a democratic sovereign, just in case it was a committee of the whole. It was an assembly of all citizens that actually dictated what was to be done by anyone, dictated what the law was. It's worth mentioning in passing, when Baudin introduces that notion of democracy as involving everybody, every citizen. Of course, he thought the citizenry might be restricted. In the period he was writing, it would have been assumed in general that it didn't include women, for example. But he thought that every citizen should be part of that body, and that's what a democracy was. Baudin was no friend of democracy, it must be said, and I think he defines democracy in this way so as to make it look pretty and feasible. He himself actually favored monarchy, the single supreme sovereign. Okay, so if the sovereign can be an individual or an agency, that raises the question of, well, how could it actually operate as a group, as an agency? And he took the view, which was actually further developed really and more theoretically developed by Hobbes in the following century, which was that a group could rule, could speak for the group as a whole, for the state as a whole, could dictate what was the law and how it was to be enforced, who was to do the enforcing of the law, by means of voting on each issue, and on each issue accepting what the majority said. So it's worth thinking about this. In the case of the individual sovereign, within the state, the individual has his or her own voice, and that voice is authorized as the voice that gives law, so that other people just simply fall in line with that voice. They do what they have to do under the law when it says what the law is, and they act as it says they should act if they are officials of the state, for example, who are to enforce the law, perhaps against other citizens, against other members of the state, or if, of course, they are to act as ambassadors, for example, in representing the state elsewhere. They all rally behind, they all follow the voice of that single spokesperson, and the single spokesperson is given total authority as the commander of the law, and that is the monarch in Baudin's view. What he thinks about the group, whether it be an aristocratic assembly or a democratic, as he called it, assembly, what he thinks about as the group is that it too can have a voice which others can authorize, individuals can authorize. And the idea is that its voice would be whatever the majority in the group on any issue actually support. So if the majority vote in favor of a certain sort of law, imposing a certain sort of sanction on, for example, those who break that law, then that is like the voice of an individual monarch, and subjects within the state have to fall in line with that law. And if, of course, by majority voting, there's a decision made on exactly how to police the law and who is to enforce it and who is to be appointed to various offices, again, it's the voice of the majority that decides. He and Hobbes, and indeed Rousseau too, thought that the inclusive sovereign, say the democratic sovereign, the plenipotentiary group, the plenary group, I should say, they thought that that group could delegate jobs to others who would be the administrators of the state. But that group, that assembly, aristocratic or democratic, would have the ultimate say on what the law was, on who was to enforce it, on how they were to enforce it, and so on. In other words, they would act as a body just in the way in which the individual monarch, as they thought of it, would act. So they allowed that the sovereign may not, so to speak, be always doing everything. The sovereign can stand back and, having dictated what the law is in various issues, can delegate authority to different individuals in then applying the law, in executing it, in sanctioning people for breaking it, and so on. It's just worth mentioning in passing that there is one big difference between Baudin and Hobbes on the one side and Rousseau on the other, even though they all believe in the need for an absolute sovereign in a state. Baudin and Hobbes each thought, as I mentioned, that there could be three sorts of state, each with a different sovereign: the monarchical state, the aristocratic state, and the democratic state. Rousseau thought that no state that was legitimate, that citizens had a reason to accept, could be ruled by either just an individual as sovereign or just a small committee of the few as sovereign. He believed to that extent that in a legitimate state it had to be governed by an assembly of all its citizens. He didn't call himself Democrat, though that was the term that Baudin used, because he felt that in a democracy, as Baudin described it, this assembly would have to also, or could at any rate, also get involved in resolving disputes, for example, as in doing court work, or in actually applying the law, in sanctioning people, and so on. And he thought that that would be a bad thing. He thought it was infeasible, but he also thought that it would mean that the people in the assembly would be influenced by their particular attachments to other people and so on in determining what the law was. They wouldn't be impersonal enough, detached enough from the life, their own private lives, in organizing things and dictating how things should be done as the general sovereign in the state. Anyhow, so what we have is, now we've got these three people, these three great figures. Of course, there are many others in the tradition at that period as well, who are very insistent that a state always involves laws, that laws are commands, that if you're going to have commands, there has to be a single commander, and that if there is a commander, that commander had better not be subject to anybody else and not be subject to his or her or its commands, that it should be in that sense absolutely supreme, above the law, and have absolute power over what form the law should take. Okay, so can we extract from these thinkers a characterization of sovereignty that might apply in our own day? Well, I think we can, and I think it does apply in our own day. And on that account, a sovereign is an agent or an agency that basically dictates the framing and the application of law, although maybe indirectly by appointing delegates and so on. But it's the ultimate source, in that sense, of control over the law. That's the first element. The second element is that this sovereign must not be subject to any constraint from other bodies, other individuals. And the third constraint, which I haven't stressed really up to this point, but was very much part of all their thinking, was that this sovereign had to be accepted in the role of commanding and giving law. It had to be generally accepted in the community that this was the boss, so to speak, that this was the one who was in charge, and that it was the commands of that person or party, that body, that established what the law was and what should be obeyed. They all thought, I think, that you couldn't really have an effective system of law unless you had a body meeting those three conditions. It determines what the law is and how to enforce it. It does this without being subject to any other agent or agency. It's the supreme boss in that sense. And it does this with the general acceptance of the people. Now, as with many of these things, you have to put in a couple of qualifications. So let me put in the, as it were, annoying qualifications at this point. One is that they all accepted that though the commander, the sovereign, would not be subject to the dictates of another body, to constraints from outside, so to speak. It was different if the body, the sovereign, had agreed in contract to accept certain constraints. So, for example, they accepted that the sovereign in a state might, on behalf of the state, after all, he, she, it is the boss, make treaties with other states, for example, and might, under those treaties, commit itself to accepting a certain sanction if it broke the treaty. And they all thought that it could indeed be subject to such a sanction. But that was really a contracted sanction. What they really believed in saying the commander, the sovereign, must not be subject to an external constraint is they meant an external, uncontracted constraint. That's one qualification. The second qualification to do with the constraint is that they accepted as a matter of course that if the sovereign was an agency or a group, like the assembly voting by majority on what to make law or how to have the law enforced, they accepted that that was a constraint on the group, that in following, in dictating what is to be the law and how things are done, it has to follow majority voting. They also accepted, of course, that the group, by majority voting, could decide to require a more than majority in support of certain sorts of laws, because that would be binding itself under its own procedures. But it couldn't just decide in any old way without taking a vote on what was to be the law or how it was to be enforced. It was constrained to operate by majoritarian procedure. But that was an internal constraint. Okay, so I said there are three elements to sovereignty as it emerges from these people. A sovereign is an agent or agency that dictates what the law is, how it is to be enforced, without external constraint. And I really stress now without external uncontracted constraint, and the other qualification that internal constraints like the procedure of following majority voting is not a problem because it's a precondition of the group operating as an agency that it follow that procedure. There's one last constraint. I said that in order for the individual or the group to play the role of sovereign, of the supreme commander who gives the law and dictates how it's to be enforced, it has to be accepted in that role. Now that really requires careful thought, because Baudin and Hobbes certainly, Rousseau was somewhat different, but Baudin and Hobbes certainly thought that while people in general had to accept that such and such an individual or body was the sovereign, laying down the law, they wouldn't have to enthuse about that regime of sovereignty. For example, they might live in a society where they would much prefer have a different sort of regime. For example, they might live in a society that was monarchical, and they might each prefer that they actually live in a society that was, in Baudin's sense, democratic. But the fact that each of them thinks, as they might, that there's no way we can move over to a democracy, no way we could get everybody to agree or to realize that other people agree, and that we're more or less stuck with this. insofar as they think that at least being stuck with this is better than anarchy, is better than having no state at all, they would accept the existing legislator, the existing lawmaking sovereign, in this case, individual monarch. So the qualification I want to insist on is that for these people, acceptance didn't amount to very much. But now, extracting from their thought, we have this notion of sovereignty I've described for you with three elements to it. An agency that dictates the law, first of all. Secondly, an agency that does this without external, uncontracted constraint, that it's its own boss to that extent. And thirdly, an agency that does this with general acceptance within the population. Now, I think that Baudin and Hobbes and Rousseau were really onto something important in arguing that in order for there to be an effective legal regime, there really has to be a sense of who the sovereign is. There has to be an agent recognized as the ultimate source of law and accepted, however reluctantly, as the source of law. Otherwise, it won't really be a very effective or continuing regime of law. It will veer towards anarchy. They all thought, incidentally, that anarchy was so bad that really I should say Baudin and Hobbes thought, Rousseau again an exception, that anarchy was so bad that no one had the right to challenge an existing sovereign because that was to risk anarchy. Someone who followed them in that, incidentally, was Immanuel Kant, who argued, if you remember, those of you who know your Kant and political philosophy, that actually no one has the right to oppose government in word or deed because that is to risk anarchy. I'm not sure we should go along with that element in the understanding of sovereignty, but I do think we should accept that an effective legal regime really requires an agent or agency that lays down the law without external uncontracted constraint and with general acceptance among the population. Else it isn't going to work very well as a legal regime. And now with that by way of background, I'm going to look in the next recording at the thesis that you can't have any sovereign at all in a decentralized state, which is what the absolutists argued. And then in the third recording, I'm going to argue that yes, you can. I'm going to argue against that inconsistency thesis. Thank you very much.